Welcome to today's session. Welcome to the 2020 Civic Arts Advocacy Summit. My name is Audrey Gomez. I am the Education Director for C4 Atlanta, and I would like to introduce today's speakers for our first session today, which is called Nonprofit Do's and Don'ts and Arts Policy Updates with Nelson Mullins and C4 Atlanta. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first speakers, which are going to be Nelson Mullins, who are doing a presentation on nonprofit do's and don'ts, and I'm going to let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Good morning. We're delighted to have the opportunity to present to you this morning. My name is Stan Jones. I'm the head of the lobbying team at Nelson Mullins Law Firm. I'm joined this morning by Helen Sloat and Sam Martique. We have a lobbying group of 4 people in our Atlanta office. We like being lobbyists. We are part of a very big law firm, about 800 folks spread out around the country. We have about 100 of the 800 work in government relations, and we sort of like to think of ourselves as policy lobbyists, interested in helping people maneuver through the government to get things that help their lives be better. We are in Atlantic Station in Midtown Atlanta. There's about 160 people here in the Atlanta office. And we're the folks that are sort of on the road all the time at the state capitol, visiting legislators in their homes. Let me say it's a lot of fun. And one of our goals this morning is to encourage you all to get more involved. It's fun in a different way than people think. I'm old enough, for example, to have watched the time when one of the legislators climbed over the balcony to stop the clock at midnight on the last day of the session. The session is supposed to end at midnight on the 40th day, the 40th biblical day. And he stopped the clock at 5 of 12 because there was about 30 minutes of business left to do. It's a famous picture. It makes fun of the legislator, and it's not really fair, but it is kind of funny. That guy was the smartest guy in the Georgia legislature at the time. He was a very, very talented lawyer from Middle Georgia. He had a little too much bourbon. So there's still bourbon in politics, but there's not very much. As lobbyists too, we sort of want to protect ourselves. There's another funny picture about lobbying that shows a lobbyist sitting at a piano, and it says, "Please don't tell my mother I'm a lobbyist. She thinks I'm a piano player in a bordello." Well, it's not really like that, but people sort of have that image of it. And so one thing we want to talk about is we want to dispel some of that. We want to invite you to participate more directly in the process. We think what we do is important. We know the government affects our lives. Many, many people, maybe most people these days, think they can raise their kids, send them to school, work their job, go to church or their synagogue, and that's their life. But so many things that you do every day are affected by what the government does. Whether it's paying for the public schools, whether it's permitting you to have a voucher to go to private school, whether it's helping make sure that everybody has health care. That's important because those of us who do have health insurance pay for those who don't through our insurance premiums as well as through our taxes. The government affects whether our food is safe. It affects, whether the air is cleaner. So these things are all very important, and we want to invite you as arts organizations, as artists, to get more involved. Come on in, the water's fine. It is a very elaborate, complicated ball ground at the Georgia Capitol. I like the ball ground metaphor. My brother-in-law's got a vineyard in LJ, so we drive by ball ground 6 times a year, and that's the meeting ground, the place where a nation, an Indian nation, came together to entertain itself and to settle major issues. That's what the Capitol's about. It's about Georgia. We're a huge state. We're the 7th largest state right now. We'll probably eventually pass Pennsylvania. We've already passed them in this election in a funny way, or at least we're parallel now. And our 11 million people have got a lot to say, and we want to teach you about how to talk about that. We think it's important. We're going to be talking about nonprofit organizations a lot. And we're doing that because we believe that most of you are participating in some kind of nonprofit organization oriented to the arts. And we're speaking this morning for C4, a nonprofit organization. Not everybody realizes that there are multiple types of nonprofit organizations. So the most common one, a public charity, or said as a 501c3 organization, is a very particular tax status. And it allows money to be given to the entity, and the donation to the public charity is deducted on the donor's tax base or tax return. There are limitations on C3 organizations, 501c3 public charities, that are not the same as other types of nonprofit organizations, like the Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit organization, a trade association is a nonprofit organization. And those other nonprofit organizations can do more lobbying than C3 organizations can do. We're also going to be talking about some differences between making a campaign contribution, which is prohibited to a C3 organization itself, but not prohibited to its members, needless to say. And C3 organizations have limits on how much lobbying they can do. And so those of you who are leading C3 organizations want to be sure that you're not forfeiting your tax exemption. You're not forfeiting the ability to receive a donation for which somebody else gets a tax deduction. So we're going to be talking some about rules of the game for the organizations, but we're not talking about you're forfeiting your free speech as an individual. We're talking about how do you weave through the rules of the IRS really about what public charities can do and can't do. So we're going to talk a little bit about why you should be involved. We're going to talk about some of the why not or what not about some of these limitations I've just been summarizing. And then we're going to talk about how. Sam is a lot younger than Helen and me, and he knows more about social media. I know it exists. I know how to push a few buttons, but what we're going to try to talk about is how politics is evolving, and it gives opportunities to affect things that are different than they used to be. When I got started, if you could write 3 letters to a legislator and they came from different angles, that was enough to persuade somebody to do something. So now you might say, well, you need 10 letters or you need thousands of emails. So things change over time, and we're going to try to talk about that. But next, my able, delightful partner of 25 years, Helen Sloat, is going to talk about what's involved. Why should you be involved, Helen?
Great. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this morning. So let's talk about who is an advocate. Well, we put in the definition of an advocate from the dictionary in here into one of the slides, but actually an advocate, it's you. You're the one who defends or maintains a cause or a proposal or an idea. So you might ask, well, why should I be an advocate or engage in advocacy? Well, that's pretty simple. You want to engage and advocate on your behalf or your industry because it's going to impact you. It could impact you personally. It could impact your livelihood, your home, or your family. But it's also really good to advocate for your industry. Today we're here, as Stan mentioned, because of the arts community and your profession as an artist. And Stan also referenced the fact that many individuals don't really pause and think about how government intersects with them. So you don't really think about how policies, which is set by lawmakers at not just the federal level, but also the state and local levels, how that policy actually impacts them. While there may be changes in laws which have an impact, there are also impacts, for instance, through public funding. Those impacts may actually be felt individually. It could be felt through your fellow artists, or it could be felt through your artistic community as a whole. As a reminder, there are many examples where government's establishment of policy may directly impact or intersect with you. And Stan gave some great examples of that a few moments ago. It could be the establishment of a tax, perhaps in the way in which you sell a piece of your art. It could be a tax or a fee on the way you do your banking transactions. It could be establishment of arts education in schools. And it may include, dance, theater, visual arts, music. But remember, in each of those instances, someone has been advocating on that behalf to include those ideas in the instructional curriculum here in Georgia. There are also other ways in which government and you can intersect by just the actual appointments to various commissions and boards. And for instance, here in this particular, realm, we're talking about the Georgia Council for the Arts, perhaps. But as an aside, if you think about it and go back and research it, you will find that the arts are actually mentioned in Georgia's Constitution. They actually mention arts and sciences in the writing of the Constitution. And over time, there have been a number of different organizations in the arts world that are touched by the state's constitution. For instance, the Georgia Commission on the Arts and the Georgia Council for the Arts and Humanities. Again, remember, somebody actually was out there advocating for the inclusion of that. So arts funding, as I mentioned before, is also in many budgets. It's not only in local budgets, but it's also in state and federal budgets. But here locally, that the city of Atlanta actually has a grants program for the arts. Many of you may be aware of that. It also has a blueprint for the arts here in the city of Atlanta. Again, I mention these things in particular because there was advocacy around these issues for their inclusion and promotion. So it is really important to use your voice because it's personal for you. It's also local. As one has often heard, all politics are local. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how you use your voice aside from actually promoting a piece of legislation or funding. Well, you use your voice as an artist to help a political campaign or position, for instance, that a candidate might have in a number of different ways. And you do that as a volunteer. So you may volunteer to put out signs, or you may volunteer to address mailers for a candidate, or you may volunteer to make phone calls on an individual's behalf, or you may actually use your talents as an artist for visual or sound effects for the productions that a candidate might use. But the list goes on, it's endless. So as a volunteer, you must do this campaign work on your own behalf and in your own personal capacity, and not on the behalf of a nonprofit organization where you may work or where you may serve on a board. So you ask as a volunteer and one speaking out to elected officials, can you give me some tips on how I do that? Well, sure, there are a number of things that we can provide you as far as tips are concerned on when you go out to actually talk to elected officials. First of all, be professional, introduce yourself, and be able to calmly explain your position without any emotion. Use facts and be very courteous in your approach. And be able to substantiate those facts when you do talk to these individuals. If you are asked a question by a lawmaker, please do not guess at an answer. If you do not know an answer, just explain, I will be happy to research this and get back to you with a response. Be a resource to these individuals and offer to be a resource, because more than likely you're going to know more about your issue that you're talking to them about than they will know. Now, granted, that's not always the case, but many times instances that's the case. So always be courteous, be polite, and always thank the individual for their time. Follow up with a thank you note. You'll be surprised. Most lawmakers love getting a handwritten note from someone in the mail. I know that may seem sort of archaic, but it's true. They seem to remember those kinds of personal touches. Now, I know emails are always great. As long as you say thank you, that's a positive. but an actual letter is also another great way to follow up. And the reason why a letter is a good way to follow up is that you're getting a second bite at that discussion, because you can include your white paper or actual data points that you may not have handed that individual at the time that you talked with them. So again, these are just some tips that I've come up with over the course of time. And I'm now going to flip this presentation back to Stan so he can explain more as to why it's critical to know that when you speak or act on your own behalf for your own personal being versus when you're going to speak or act on behalf of your nonprofit, and how that may actually occur and what the law is around that. So Stan?
Thank you, Helen. So let me say again, we're going to be talking about primarily about the laws about lobbying by tax exempt organizations that are public charities or frequently called 501c3 organizations. Let me say again, there are other types of nonprofit organizations who are heavily involved in influencing legislation or talking with influencing politics. So for example, there's a social welfare organization called a 501c4. Planned Parenthood has one of those. The National Rifle Association has one of those. And the rules about influencing legislation and participating in politics by a C4 are different than they are for a C3. There are trade associations and unions, C5s and C6s, that have different rules about how much of their money they can use to be involved in influencing legislation. The reason is those organizations exist to promote a very particular point of view, and they can take in money and use it for influencing legislation to some degree for politics directly. But those organizations don't have the benefit that a donation to those organizations creates a tax benefit to the donor, to the taxpayer. So an individual gives to a C3 $100 and he subtracts $100 from his taxable income, and his tax liability goes down. So as heads of a C3, you've got to pay attention to how you can survive and sustain yourself through your service activities, through the things you're selling, through the services you're performing, and through the charitable donations you're receiving. You don't want to lose that ability to have received donations that the donor gets a benefit for. And again, I want to say again, I can't say it enough, and we're going to be talking further about the differences between the things you can do as your individual self. You don't forfeit your free speech by being part of a public charity, but you've got to be very careful that your public charity, that your organization, that your membership organization is not forfeiting its ability to receive money and grant the tax deduction to the donor. Also, we're going to be talking about influencing legislation versus participating in a political campaign. A C3 organization cannot participate in a political campaign, period. The individuals can make campaign donations. The individuals can be volunteers in influencing public policy, but the organization cannot use its money to make campaign contributions or to support a candidate directly. But the C3 public charity can influence legislation, and that means a piece of law that is being considered by the federal, state, or local government. A budget is a law. You can influence a budget. But there are some limitations about how much of the public charity's resources can be used to influence legislation. So you'll see at the bottom of the slide, this is sort of the general principle. No substantial part of the activities of the C3 organization can be used to influence legislation. Influencing legislation means talking to a member of the legislature, talking to a member of the city council, a member of the county commission, a member of Congress, a member of the US Senate, or talking to the employees of those people. So that means the aides, essentially. it doesn't mean necessarily expressing a point of view about a public policy. That's not the same thing necessarily as influencing legislation. So you keep in mind when you think about the things you want to engage in, are you trying to change legislation that is pending currently before the governmental body you're thinking about? So what does insubstantial mean? It's, there's sort of been rules of thumb over time that, no more than 10 or 20% of the resources of the organization can be used to influence legislation. That's what, so if you're using less than those amounts, you are, not substantially influencing legislation or using your substantial amount of your resources to influence legislation. If you're using more than that, then you've got some issues. And there's sort of two ways to go about it. You can sort of set yourself up to think about all of your resources and whether more than a substantial part of them are used for influence. If you're using sort of it's a facts and circumstances test, you can see on the slide the types of things that are regarded as counting towards the use of your resources. Influencing legislation, presenting testimony at public hearings, correspondence with legislators, communications by electronic means, publication of documents, advocating. Now, there's some things that are not regarded as influencing legislation, as engaging in lobbying. And so they're helpful to know about. So you can present a objective analysis about an issue in a paper and even say this is what this organization believes about that organization, as long as you're not asking your members to go lobby for it. So you're not giving up your ability to analyze an issue for your organization. You can discuss an issue broadly, discuss the arts broadly in a paper. If the government asks you to give them, if a legislator or a commissioner or the mayor asks you to give information and advice about an issue, that's not influencing legislation either. You have been requested to do that. You can always make comments about a public policy that's going to affect your organization. Is it going to change your tax status? Is it going to drive you out of business? Does it affect what powers and things, duties you have to your membership or to the public? And you can communicate with government officials who are not legislators. So, you can talk to the government agency about how that agency's policy influences you. And here's what you think about what the government entity or should think about, like the Council on the Arts. If you're not trying to influence a particular piece of legislation and you're just giving information to the official about what's important to you, that's not necessarily lobbying. The next slide really talks about, there are some classifications that are in part of the Internal Revenue Code that allow an organization to say, we do not spend more than a substantial part of our resources on lobbying. And it's an election you make on a form from the IRS called 5768. It's an election to be measured by the tests we're going to show you in a minute, rather than having sort of a vaguer notion hanging out there that your organization's tax exempt status is at risk because you are doing more than an insubstantial part of your activity around lobbying activity. So you can make a test, and we show you on the next slide, more or less, we show you how the internal revenue systems are set up, where you can sort of measure whether you're doing too much or not. So what this chart shows you is, and so it's called the amount of exempt purpose expenditures. So that means the money you're spending serving your mission. If it's less than $500,000 in this chart, you can spend 20% of that amount on influencing legislation, on lobbying activity. And you can read down the chart, if your revenues are between 500,000 and $1 million, you can spend $100,000 on lobbying plus 15% over $500,000. And this sort of comes down through the chart. As you can see, it's based on how much revenue and expenditure that the entity has. Now, I should say it is based on expenditure. What are you spending on salary, mail, rent, services? It's not based on how much capital you necessarily receive. So you might have $1 million in donations one year and you only spend $500,000. So this test is based on the $500,000, not on the $1 million you might have received. You know, it's easy for a lawyer to say this. In some ways, I hate to say it, but some of these things are complicated. So you're going to need to talk to your lawyer, your accountant, when you feel like the activities that you want to spend money on to promote legislation are coming up against this roughly 20% test of how much money you spend. So some things are easy to measure. If you hire a lobbyist and pay him $50,000 and your expenditure, total expenses are $500,000, you're 10% of your money spent on hiring that lobbyist. But it gets more complicated when you start doing things like mailing out letters, or, you know, buying pamphlets, printing flyers. So some of those things count and some don't. You don't necessarily have to count the percentage of your salary that you are spending doing lobbying activities. But you can think about it. Let's say you get invited to the Capitol to talk about your arts organization, and it's at the request of the committee that you're speaking to, say the Education Committee. They've invited you to come make that speech. And so if it took 10% of your $50,000 salary to do that, that's not actually lobbying. If you volunteer to do that because you're promoting the arts budget or a specific piece of legislation, then you start to get in the complication of figuring out, you know, how much of the time of you or your employees are actually spent on influencing legislation. Next slide just makes the point again. You do not forfeit your free speech rights because you are the executive director of an association. You can still make a campaign contribution. You can still sign in your individual capacity your name to the endorsement of a candidate. But you just have to be careful and thoughtful about what you're doing individually in your own name and what you're doing in the name of your organization. We did put on this slide what the limits on contributions are. They're probably appalling to many of you, certainly folks in small organizations or people you know, who are making the average income in America is around $80,000. But campaigns are expensive. You've obviously just been through one of the most expensive campaigns in American history. And it was expensive at the presidential level. It was expensive at the Senate level. It was expensive at the local legislator levels. But the state law has rules about how much an individual can give to a candidate to run that candidate's campaign. So the number for statewide offices like governor, senator, secretary of state is high at $7,000. The number for the House members of the House and Senate is $2,800. Just so you know, these limits apply to the first election and to a runoff election and to the general election. So that $7,000 number is for the primary of either party. When the candidate's running to get the nomination of the Democratic or Republican Party, you can give that governor $7,000. Your spouse can give $7,000. Your children can give $7,000. This is where politics gets messy and for some, you know, oriented, and it is oriented to people who have more funding. Now, there's no question about that. And the primary, those numbers are cut in half. In a primary runoff, they're cut in half. But you can give it again in the general election. So we would not be trying to tell you that politics isn't expensive or complicated, or, there's extra influence from people who can finance a campaign. And Sam's going to talk about some of the things that happen in that process. They're expensive. It costs $10,000 to send out these placards in the mail to the members of a Georgia House district. So the contested districts maybe had 5 of those over the course of the general election we've just finished. So that's $50,000 just to do the mailing. The TV ads are obviously expensive. You don't use TV ads for the lower races because they are expensive, and it's a waste of money. But we said here, we're not trying to tell you you can't participate in the process. You still have your free speech. You can make contributions. You just have to be careful about how you do it and in whose name you do it. The next slide we've got from the C4 people there, some examples of activities that sort of raise some of the questions we're talking about. So in each of these examples you see at the bottom of the slide, we're trying to sort of raise up the question about, is this activity influencing legislation or not? Is it involved in a campaign or not? So that it help you think through the things that you maybe want to do and then say, well, what caution should I have about whether I do that or not? So the first example, can the executive director write an op-ed about a position? Well, the answer is yes, you can write in the name of the organization an op-ed about a public policy issue. But if you are advocating for a specific piece of legislation, then you have to be more cautious. Then you're using the official position of the director, in writing, trying to influence legislation. So you can try to influence policy and explain issues is different than saying we promote X or Y. And of course, you can promote a bill. You just can't use more than a insubstantial part of the resources of the organization to do that. A group issues a scorecard for candidates. Is that permitted? Yes, you can have a nonpartisan scorecard on the people running for office, as long as you're not endorsing any one of them. An endorsement means asking your members to vote for them. So you'll see these scorecards all over the place among education organizations, for example. You certainly see them, around issues like abortion or choice. An artist creates a piece of art to support a candidate. Maybe the candidate uses it in an auction, maybe uses it in an ad. Well, an artist can do that. That's free speech. That's the individual doing it. If it's done, in a workshop by the C3 organization, then maybe it's a little bit different question. So there's some things you need to consider that you want to do. You need to do them individually and not using the resources of the organization. Can your employees run for office? Of course. Now, if you're the executive director, you may not want that employee not to do his or her job for the next 6 months that a campaign commands and demands in today's political life. But again, no one loses their ability to be, a actor as an individual in free speech. Maybe you want to put that employee on a leave of absence, so that, there's no question that you're paying the salary for the person to run. I will tell you, though, this is a fairly complicated issue. You probably wouldn't be surprised, but there are lots of members of the legislature in Georgia who work for a nonprofit organization during the time they're not sitting at the Capitol voting on bills. So there are people out there who have salaries, from nonprofits who are members of the General Assembly of the County Commission. Keep in mind, places like Georgia, we have a volunteer legislature. Now, it's a fiction that's not really true, because it takes almost all of your time to be a member of the legislature. It takes all your time during January, February, March, first part of April. It takes all of your time 2 weeks before an election. It doesn't take all your time the other periods, but it may take half of your time. So, if you got an employee that wants to run, it's smart to try to take them through the drill of saying, hey, this is really demanding. Let's talk about how you're going to be able to do your job. And then if you're the executive director, do you say, I can't run this organization if I don't have all of your time? So maybe that's why you put somebody on a leave of absence, for example, or furlough or something. A social media manager for the organization reports an article with a political viewpoint. If it's a policy point of view, it's probably can be okay. If it's endorsing a candidate, it's not. These are the kind of things you need to sort out, talk through with your lawyer, with your tax lawyer about. A theater wants to hold a town hall event. Okay, the theater's a nonprofit. The theater is renting out the event. Well, theaters do rent their event space to politicians for their campaign activities. If doing that is like the endorsement by the nonprofit of the candidate, then it's a problem. If it can be done in a more neutral way, it's not. So we wanted to just sort of talk through some of the common examples I think that we got from the C4 sponsors here. I'm going to turn now to our able young social media star, Sam Martique, and he's going to talk about grassroots issues going forward. And let me say that what you spend on grassroots to influence legislation does count as lobbying. You know, if you're spending grassroots organization to endorse a candidate, that counts as politics. So there are things you can and you can't do. Sam?
Yeah, so briefly, I just want to touch on a quick, I guess, a disclaimer of if you're, using political advocacy, you want to make sure that none of it's coming from your organization. So an example, if you're writing a letter, don't have a letterhead from your C3 organization. If you're sending an email, use your personal email and not your organization's email. Don't post on social media with the social media account of your actual organization. Use your personal social media for things like that. And just a quick note on grassroots, I worked on a campaign a couple of years ago, and there was just an unbelievable amount of mobilization of new people that have never been involved in the political process before. From that time that I was on that campaign to now, it's exploded even more. There's an unbelievable amount of people that are in the political world these days and paying a lot more attention to it than they did in the past. As a collective group of artists, there's a lot of ways you can use your voice. You can organize with other artists in order to act as a resource for other people that are in the arts, communicating with your group to organize events or phone banking. Again, make sure you're not holding those events in a space that's owned by your organization. You want to make sure you avoid things like that to toe the substantial part test line. And it's always important to stay on message. Having a uniform and simple message is definitely the most effective way. You don't want to confuse elected officials with a lot of jargon from the industry on a simple message. Clear and to the point is the best way to get something accomplished, and having a lot of people showing those clear and to the point messages will be the most effective way for you to get your goals reached. Just a quick note on social media. So obviously, I think everyone knows now, especially these days, social media has just become a cornerstone of American politics. You see elected officials on social media in on their own accounts, interacting with constituents, interacting with reporters and journalists and other people about issues and about things that they say on a very regular basis. So it's really important that when you're on social media and you're interacting with these legislators or these elected officials, that you follow a few, kind of rules and guidelines in your mind to make sure you're not crossing any boundaries. You want to always make sure that you're being cordial, you're not getting angry, you're not losing your cool. An angry response will get you nowhere. It'll probably just make a legislator shut down and not listen to anything else you have to say. Also keep in mind that anything you say can probably be screenshotted even if you delete it. So it exists, it's out there. You don't want to muddy the waters of the issue that you're working on or advocating for the arts generally by having your negative comment ether for everyone to see. And so, again, make sure that you're always avoiding political messaging on any official account from your C3 organization. The common thing you'll see in a Twitter bio is retweets do not equal an endorsement. Well, I'd say be using caution on that, because some people might think it does. So, if you have doubts about whether or not something that you're thinking of tweeting from an account that you run for an organization could cross the line, avoid tweeting that thing. And then just a quick note on becoming part of the process. A lot of stuff happens on Twitter and Facebook these days. Like I said, the state Senate and the state House both have Twitter accounts, official Twitter accounts, where they post links to what's going on. They live stream almost everything that's happening in the Capitol at any given time. So following those accounts is a great way to keep engaged with the process, know what's going on, know when something that you find interesting or you find important is going to be coming up. And as you develop and create relationships with elected officials, you can use that to explain an issue. It's easier to pick up the phone and call someone you have a relationship with than it is to pick up the phone and cold call someone you've never talked to before. And then just another note on grassroots, using your grassroots network as a call to action is a great way to get something done. Personalized notes, like Helen said before, always very effective. Boilerplates, emails, a lot of these issues, the bigger issues that they see in the Capitol they're going to get 1,000, they're going to get 2,000 emails. They're all going to say the same thing with the only thing on the email change is the person's name that they filled out on a website. Having worked in these offices, I don't think those are really that effective personally. I think they're kind of glossed over and they might see a lot of emails coming in about something, but they're not going to read them. If they're, personally addressed, if they have a unique subject line, then they're going to be read, they're going to be looked at. And I think that makes it a more effective way to reach the legislators and make sure your issue is heard. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Audrey just in case we have any questions from what we were talking about. So I'll stop the share.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just retool my share here. So just a couple questions in the chat. One of them, and I had one too about funding. So for instance, if your organization is not necessarily giving money, but let's say you have a resource that you could share with someone, what is the, does in-kind resources count the same as like financial donations?
Well, there's always an issue of, what's sort of quantifiable. The donation of something like office space, can be evaluated, by the Internal Revenue sources, the use of the substantial of the resources of an organization to determine whether it's been more than insubstantial, whether it's been substantial. So, if you're making the election that we described with the IRS, things sort of get more quantified and you have some room for like use of space. You're not necessarily assigning, the cost of the time of a leasehold, to the activity, the influencing legislation activity. I think you generally speaking need to be careful about like letting a candidate, use your space because, like we've been trying to accent, the influencing legislation is a separate question from the participating in a campaign. But I don't think you can't say carte blanche, in-kind things don't count. They do. And it's just sort of vaguer about how they get accounted for if you end up with a question from the Internal Revenue Service about whether the organization is violating its C3 status.
I'm muted. We have one more question. What does Nelson Mullins feel about the probability of advocating for dedicated state funding for arts organizations, more than GCA funding via a tax, etc.?
So we can make some comments about that, and I'll invite everybody to jump in.
The water's fine.
Yeah, the water's warm.
And just to reiterate, because Jessica just put in the chat, the next part of this session will be about national trends and kind of some other programs around our things that we are doing locally with arts policy. So we might address some of those things in the next part of the session too.
Sure. And so, maybe the place to start is to say that, any tax issue is kind of fair game, and it has to be dealt with at the federal or the state level by and large. And particularly if you're talking about some kind of dedicated tax, that is a state law issue first and a local issue second. The one reason I was hesitating, trying to think about how to describe this, we live in a very sort of conservative era, in a state that will remain heavily Republican at the legislative level. That means that you have lots of people who want the government to do less, not more, and taxes get browbeat all the time, as you well know. Now, it's not a very sophisticated cudgel or hammer. Just to make the point, at the state level, we've had a 6% state income tax for a very long time. We lowered it by 1/4%. So, taxes are not high at the Georgia level. They're higher in some other states. Property taxes, which are at the local level, are the ones that have been going up, in the last few decades. State taxes generally have not gone up. Federal taxes have mostly been reduced, not raised. Of course, the presidential election may affect that a little bit in reaction to the tax cut in 2017. But we live in an era when the sort of public believes that it's taxed too much, even if that's not true in some low tax states. It believes that the government doesn't spend money wisely. I don't even think myself that that's particularly true, although there's certainly always egregious examples of research projects at the federal level that seem sort of useless. But in that context, it's hard to bring up a dedicated tax issue. It's hard because in Georgia, the Republican majority wants to lower taxes. They want to be on that side of this debate. Now, actually lowering taxes means you got to do something about property taxes, frankly, because those are the ones going up, as I mentioned, not the state income tax, not the state federal income tax. We have had some changes in our state sales taxes that are implemented by our local government. On the Republican side, those are viewed as user taxes. The people who pay the tax get the service or get the good. That's different than a graduated income tax where you've got people making more money paying more income tax. So it's not an easy environment to propose a dedicated tax because of our political ideology and resources here. And right now in Georgia, if you want to propose a dedicated tax, generally speaking, you've got to say, this will save government money somewhere else. So that if you're going to impose a new tax burden, the benefits have got to be very clear of doing that. And you've got to kind of come to grips with this overall mantra, no new taxes. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that, it's not an easy question.
Yeah.
But I would say readily, go for what you need, and making changes like that are not 1-year propositions. They are 3 to 5 year propositions. So you've got to figure out what you want. You got to say why it's a benefit to the public at large. You got to go talk to the legislators who run the budget, to the tax committees, the Ways and Means in the House, Finance in the Senate. See if you can find an ally or two, sit down with them and plot out how you're going to make the case for what you want. But you got to think about it as a 5-year project.
You also might want, I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to fund, but if it's something that's not just humongous, something that could be done through a direct appropriation, that's another issue totally separate. And you could perhaps talk to the folks on the appropriations committees about trying to fund a particular idea through the state budgeting process. That's a little bit different.
So I will say, you know, what we try to do as lobbyists is to help our clients understand the whole context, find the right place like Helen's describing, whether it's appropriations or ways and means, find allies to start with, cultivate. You know, we're the coaches for how you sort of set out a strategy to do whatever your goal is.
Okay. We have time for one last question. And I have one in the chat. It says, do you recommend documenting personal campaign activities so that they can be accounted for in a certain way? Example, if I personally volunteer with a partisan organization, should I be tracking my time, resources, hours spent in order to back it up if it is brought up as an organizational activity? If so, is there a best practice for this?
What do you think, Helen?
I think that's a great idea to track whatever it is you're doing, so that you have your own documentation for the activities that you've engaged in.
But the question was asked about campaign activities. Remember, the C3 cannot engage in campaign activities. The individual can. So if you know, there's another question about how you're tracking the amount of time you spent on influencing legislation. If an organization's big enough to have an internal lobbyist and he or she spends half their time at the legislature promoting legislation, yeah, keep up with that person's time so that you know that it's 50% of whatever the salary is, and you can defend that to the IRS. You know, if you get any questions.
What about a member though, Stan? So if someone is, you know, just a member of an organization and they want a phone bank or they want to write postcards for a candidate, would they need to track that time to back up the organization?
No, a member doesn't need to do that. It's really, these issues exist more for the staff and how the organization's using its space and time.
Well, thank you so much, y'all. We really appreciate all that you had to share. I am going to turn it over now to Jessica Holland, who is C4 Atlanta's Executive Director, to share the next part of today's presentation, which is about arts policy updates. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you for the information, and just reminding everybody that we are recording this on Facebook, and we'll also be placing this on our blog as well, so we can continue to have this information be accessed. Let's see, now's the part where I go to the share screen. Cool. Audrey, I'm going to lean on you for just a sec just to make sure everything looks good.
Looks good to me.
Okay, great. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, briefly about some national conversations that are happening around arts policy, an arts policy agenda. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I don't have all the information. And in fact, I was trying to get in touch with Americans for the Arts just yesterday to ask them if Biden had published a platform, President-elect Biden. And unfortunately, it never came, but we'll look at some other resources to kind of look at what the national conversation looks like. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to read that for you. You can all read this. It's been up on your screen for a minute, but this is some stats that were pulled by Americans for the Arts. This lives on the Arts Action Fund page, and some of you may be familiar with their policy action agenda and urging Congress for support for COVID-19. This is legislation relief for the arts. This includes individuals and organizations. Right now, as we know, a lot of those conversations have been stalled out around relief packages. There's also another campaign that they're doing called Putting Creative Workers Back to Work. Again, you can find this on the Art Action Fund Action Center, and this is basically, as far as I can tell, really a campaign, to encourage us, you, and maybe other people on a nonprofit board or our nonprofit workers in the arts, to ask local communities to send out op-eds to media about why creative workers are important to your local economy. And so you have two kind of initiatives coming there. One is a policy, some legislation that they're trying to influence for arts workers to address the huge amount of job loss that has happened within our industry. And then there's also a campaign for us on the ground to encourage our local, not just our local elected officials, but also voters. And by getting the media involved, this is one way that we can help. And in fact, just a few moments ago, I was contacted by 11 Alive just to get some background information on arts workers and how that has affected workers within our city. So again, as I mentioned, I tried to find the platform for President-elect Biden. I will say this was a statement that I was able to find in Hyperallergic. Again, this actually was from The Guardian, but originally a Hyperallergic statement. So yeah, so he's a strong supporter of the arts. Yay! But what does that mean in terms of a policy? And there is a Biden Arts Policy Committee. It has 4 co-chairs. These are the chairs. Again, there's just not a lot of information about what they're doing and what that policy agenda looks like or platform looks like for the President-elect Biden. I will say that, as we're thinking about putting people back to work and workforce development, for me, that is a sort of top of mind. And so I want to give a very brief example on how we as an organization are thinking about these national conversations around job loss in the industry at the local. So how do we take that information and synthesize that to a local level and enact that sort of policy focus on workforce development to create programming. So I want to start with the program that we're working on, but before I get into that, I do want to mention that I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, that all of these policies, all of this work that we're doing really needs to start with the lens of that we are in an inequitable society. Arts advocacy cannot be done in a vacuum. A lot of the things that have happened and the violence that has been committed against our communities in the form of financial violence or physical violence or geographic violence is not an accident. And some of you may know this, that I am working on a degree, a policy degree, and public administration degree in urban planning and economic development. And as I'm going through planning classes and reading language from planning activities back in the day, it's very obvious the language that is in those planning documents was meant to favor white people over the Black community in Atlanta. And I think the biggest example of that is if you look at Interstate 7585 or the connector, the language around, coming through an African-American community and using words like a, undesirable neighborhood. The coded language for racism is definitely there. And it has been memorialized in these plans. And so if we're looking at that, plus the fact that our community has an incredible wealth gap, we sort of fluctuate between number 1 and number 2 in the nation for wealth inequality. We have to start with that lens. We have to start with that lens. And I think it's sort of parallel. There was a story on NPR yesterday about, you know, having a vaccine and how, you know, to distribute those vaccinations to the most vulnerable communities. And it's the same way in the arts, and I think it's the same way in a lot of remedies. We really need to help the more vulnerable populations first. And that doesn't mean, and this was an example that was given on NPR yesterday, it doesn't mean that if I'm standing in line and somebody who is Black is standing in line in front of me, then I get skipped for a vaccine. It doesn't mean taking away, right? It means remedying things that have been done to the community for a long time, that as we work in advocacy, we should be aware of that lens. So this is the project that we have. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. So this is what we call the Creative Industries COVID-19 Recovery Plan. We've actually launched this. We've started the match. I'll talk a little bit more about this. In essence, the plan is to match artists with local small businesses. The artists are paid. We pay them. And we pay the small businesses a stipend to also work with the artists, and the artists are there to help in this iteration in our pilot phase to help these small businesses work on customer re-engagement post, or not post-COVID, but during a pandemic world. And so some of the objectives, just like the national objectives, means that we're providing jobs for gig workers who can aid in small business recovery. We're focusing specifically on Black-owned businesses and regrowth. And we're looking at building skills for art workers. I want to be very clear that one of the things I would caution as we start talking about workforce development in the arts and these types of policies is that we're not really talking about retraining artists to go do something else. I think that's a horrible way to look at that. I think what we're looking at instead of is not necessarily retraining artists and their skills, but using those same skills that they have, that they've honed, that they're experts in, and using those to help community, right? There's a difference. You know, I don't think that every artist out there is interested in coding. Maybe some are and maybe some aren't, but this program is not designed to remove art and for more viable careers, right? So it's kind of the details of the program. It is a prioritization of Black artists and entrepreneurs. 10 artists are participating in this pilot program, and I want to emphasize that it is a pilot program. So there's a lot of things that are not necessarily perfect around because we're still developing it as we go. This is a program where we're testing a model and looking at moving it into a phase 2, in which we've secured funding for. We are looking for more funding. It is a very expensive program to run, as you can imagine. Anytime you take on something like payroll or employment, the human resources piece of it gets really expensive. This is a small program that we hope can scale up. We hope it scales up throughout the city. We hope that we can also, when we move through this pilot phase of 12 weeks, we'll be writing a white paper about it, but we're also hoping to kind of think about in this process how this might work in other communities, whether that be smaller communities or larger communities. Communities that don't have the same resources as Atlanta. How do we take this same model and share it and in the spirit of really getting those creative workers back to work, right? So right now in this particular project, this is who is involved. I put the Atlanta Regional Commission. We've had some preliminary conversations with them. I wouldn't call them sort of a hard and fast partner on this, but we'd love to include them more, especially as we get into sort of data collection But right now, this pilot phase is being funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Our community partner is the Village Market. The Village Market Atlanta is a consortium of small Black-owned businesses, and they are helping us with some of the matching piece of it. I'll also give a lot of props to Samara Minkin over at the mayor's office for helping us sort of think through this, make some connections, and really just continue to look for funding. This is something that happened very, very quickly. And I think it really just started, you know, us at C4 thinking about how do we employ people? How do we get money into people's hands? And then really just sending out an email and saying, hey, we have this idea about like matching artists and helping small businesses at the same time. I want to make a point about the small business piece. One of my board members had sent me an article that was it was in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, and in this particular article, it stated that Black-owned businesses, by the end of the year, it was expected that 45% of them would not be able to survive because of COVID-19, compared to around 17 to 20% of white-owned businesses. So you see, like, looking at that data, it really informed us on where we need to, where we could provide the most help, and where people are traditionally under-resourced. The other piece of this is really thinking about, you know, thinking about the perception of art. One of the things in advocacy that we have been grappling with as an organization and trying to think through is not only connecting to elected officials, but how do we connect to voters? And this was a kind of an article that came out in the Sunday Times. It said they interviewed people about what they thought were the top 5 essential jobs or the non-essential jobs. And the respondents out of 1,000 reported 71% of 1,000 respondents felt that the job of artist is non-essential. Number 1, see there with the little beret, that's an artist. So people love art, but people know nothing about art. People love art, but people are not they don't necessarily view artists as essential workers. And we know that through this pandemic that we've consumed a lot of art, right? I think it's been one of many coping strategies that probably a lot of us have leaned on. And so many performing arts organizations and other arts organizations have graciously provided content for entertainment for people, but also in a way to continue to engage their audiences, right? And that work is paying off. There's some evidence to support that. I know TRG, I think, our Target Resource Group, just did a study showing that that people are engaging in that virtual content. But through this program, you know, we really want to engage the artists with community. So there's a couple of outcomes that we're hoping to get out of this. As I mentioned, we have secured a second phase of funding. We hope to get additional funding. We are hoping to duplicate the national context and the interest that is there. A mentor of mine told me that, you know, if you're looking at federal dollars that could possibly become available under a new administration, then have a shovel-ready program, right? And so this was some of the urgency that we had in launching this. The first urgency being, we want to pay people. So I'll come back to the Creative Business Recovery Council. I talked a little bit about it being a model and shifting perspectives about artists. I say we is sort of a general, who's we? It's you, it's me. We are looking at creating a business recovery council, an advisory council that can really think about how Atlanta or the metro area can can rebuild our creative community, or at the very least, not lose our creative community, right? So what we want to do next is we want to go to what we're just sort of calling a whiteboard session. And I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to sort of co-facilitate helping me with the whiteboard piece. I will unshare now. Do we want to get to questions first, Audrey?
Yeah, let's do some questions.
Okay.
So there are just a couple of questions in the chat, and let's see. Let me just give me just a second to scroll up here. Let's see. Oh goodness. I'm going to go from the bottom up. So if you ask questions early on, I apologize. I'll get to your question. Do you recommend documenting? Oh, sorry. Wrong question.
Yeah, we just had a few, I think.
Bad day for the mouse to go out. Let's see. Will this be limited to just the city of Atlanta?
The program specifically, is that?
Yes, for the workforce program.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the limitation that we have on this right now is capacity. So right now, more than just even the city of Atlanta, we're focusing on the south of Atlanta right now. We hope to expand out. I mean, we hope this can go to other communities. I think that that's a bigger initiative than what capacity-wise we can do right now. My philosophy, I think, on a lot of things is that if we can create the model and share the model, then set up a community for success so that when that community has their own program, that money is circulated back within that community, right? That's sort of how I think about nonprofits sharing resources.
I think that's the only question that I see. There's some other comments. Just one second.
There's a question about if organizations are involved in Black Lives Matters activities or marches, does that affect? I'm assuming.
I think that was. I think that was for for the other presenter. So this one says, from a scientific perspective, brain and behavior studies on our species have proven that we have evolved to respond in a collective manner to stories more than facts or statistics. Why are the artists always rounded up or censored when a government wants their policy to be the only policy? Because we tell stories that give a different perspective and create more empathy. We are more than essential. We are critical to evolution and revolution. I think you would agree with that. Yeah.
Amen.
I think we would all agree with that.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that brings up a really good point even about advocacy, you know, of a colleague of mine who said data plus stories equals impact. And, you know, as human beings, we make decisions based on emotion. That's just how we operate. So we make decisions based on emotion and we justify with logic. So there's two sides to that, really. How do we tell really good stories as artists? I know at this point, the point of this is saying, how can we not be considered essential? And I totally agree with this point.
Exactly. Yeah, so I'm happy to move into some facilitation. Jessica, so and my understanding is that you are wanting to kind of facilitate some understanding of kind of what are some of the policy initiatives folks are interested in going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to lead that conversation?
Yeah, if this is, so Audrey and I are looking at, and Naja, who's on our team as well. And I want to mention also, Naja's new to our team, but she has really been more than I have the point person for this particular program. And we've also contracted Richard Dunn. If you don't know who Richard Dunn is, he's a music producer extraordinaire, and he's also helping us sort of consult through this program. But hi, Naja.
Hey, everybody.
So she's really on the ground and running with this program and is doing amazing work. I'm just the person who like signs checks and writes grants. So So what we want to do right now, this is where we want to get your feedback and we can hear your voices. What are some policy agenda items that you think are important for legislators to know about, and no ideas off the table? We want to distill this information and pass it along to our elected officials, and hopefully this will become part of a town hall meeting with elected officials in January. So we want to hear from you. What are some pressing, burning issues that you're thinking about right now for our community? And think about city, region, state. To support STEAM in school.
That
was a suggestion.
Okay.
LaDonna Williams put out, and you can put it in chat, but you can also unmute if you want. We like hearing voices too, but how do we support more STEAM initiatives in school?
Okay. Cool.
Are you asking the question?
No, it's rhetorical, but yeah, if you have suggestions, by all means. Anybody else? Policy issues. What are things that we need to be communicating with our lawmakers?
So in the chat, it says critical that they stay aware and supportive of tax initiatives for the entertainment industry. The old for every dollar contributed, we track and show that this is positively impacting our community. So I think that that really is both the regional and state issue, is the tax incentives for entertainment. I know the state is kind of on the cusp of some things for the music industry that they were doing for the film industry. And then I saw one more down here. Apologies, y'all. I'm just juggling all the boxes in Zoom. Increased arts education at schools. So is that, are you thinking about that from any particular perspective, Eric? I mean, I'm assuming this would be state level, but perhaps it's other. Increase just in general. Okay, so maybe, so if it's more generally focused, that's probably more of a state level concern. And then as it trickles, no, I hate that word, as it falls down to other areas, it gets a little more specific. Yeah. Creating budget lines in more cities for public art and developer incentives. Yes. Cool. So I'm going to just cut and paste what you said right there into our box here. Awesome. Let's see. Exposure for students. Let's see. I have a question. How do you educate? Let me see. How do you educate, engage your philanthropic partners about your legislative agenda? I think that's maybe a question for you, Jessica.
Pardon me, I was taking some notes. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think you know, we haven't really gotten to the point where we've asked to meet with some of the foundations or other potential donors. You know, the connection to the Casey Foundation, again, was through a board member, and it was really sort of a reconnection because they'd already had a relationship with this particular program manager. So I think that, you know, a lot of it is really, once we test the model a little bit, then we'll have more information to share. We want to actually get some outcomes in place before we take it a little bit larger, but so far a lot of the conversations have been phone calls and connections through other people. But we're always open to suggestions about how to better get this program or our policy agenda or things that are happening at the national level in front of our local philanthropic community.
I see in here, it says, continue to promote the value of arts and quality of life in both community and economic development, and no increase in GCA funding. So GCA, obviously state level, but this one kind of goes underneath both state and region. I think city and region, and I'm parsing some of these out, I think, in terms of places where folks are working on them, but also where there is maybe some opportunity to, sorry, y'all, trying to do too many things at once, to leverage more improvement in some of those areas. For instance, I put more community grants for, more grants and government funding for community art projects led by community businesses, organizations at state, because there's not as much of that at the state level as there is like for city and region. Let's see, Nadja, can
Audrey, since you're going back and forth, maybe Nadja can help you read and field some of those questions, because I know you have like a lot happening on your screen right now.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And not sure if we heard from Eric yet. Continue to promote the value of arts in terms of quality of life in both community and economic development. From B. Keswani, adding arts education to state creative placemaking programs that focus primarily on economic assets, but leave out how arts are such a vital component. And from Tony, we have for local, Chamber of Commerce and conventions and visitors bureaus can promote tourism and more convention business by promoting Atlanta as an entertainment destination.
Cool. Her whiteboard's pretty full. Any other things that we want to add to this whiteboard? It's a great list.
Yeah, these are great. And, you know, one of the things that, again, going back to that idea of creating an advisory committee of how to help our creative community recover is we have talked to various chambers and different stakeholders about joining a committee to help guide and also, you know, one of the things too is that if there are federal laws that are changed or tweaked or updated, you know, that from the federal government down has to go through that bureaucratic process, right, to kind of get to our local levels. And those are things that we're going to need to be educated about. We're going to need people who and can even educate some of our bureaucrats. And I'm not using that word negatively, but that's going to be a real challenge, right? Because we're going to have to now, just like we had to do with educating people about new unemployment laws, we also have to educate people about what is coming down from the federal government to help local initiatives, right?
I don't see any others. Nadja, do you see any others in the chat?
Oh, I don't.
And I think it's great that you know, we have people who are participating in this now, and as our friends from Nelson Mullins said, that we have more people participating in the civic process. I've used this example before, and I want to use it again because there, just as our speaker said before, there are small things that can affect even our whole community. And several years ago, there was a piece of legislation that would have levied a pretty hefty tax on bank transfers going out of state, right? On the outset, it was really a anti immigration bill. It was to keep money from flowing outside of the country, but it also hurt small businesses. And so we took that information that we had about how it might hurt artists and how it might hurt small businesses, and had a conversation when Stacey Abrams was then my representative, and Audrey's representative. And so we were able to have this conversation about something that, you know, somebody had posted on Facebook, and I noticed it, and then followed up on it, and had it passed, it could have cost artists a lot of money, especially if you think about touring musicians or people doing festivals. So these are the kinds of things that we really want to keep an eye on. These are the kinds of things that we need everybody's help in keeping an eye on, and to have an informed citizenry is an important piece of our democratic process.
And I also got one more question from the chat. So for the Work First program, what are the requirements for artists to apply?
Right now, it's not an open application. We will be doing that probably in a little less than a year from now. As I said, it's in a pilot phase. So we were working with artists who we've worked with before, again, just to test the model. And same with Village Market Atlanta. They are also working with businesses that have the capacity right now to do this kind of work. Now, obviously, that's going to open up some more challenges as we move into the next phase. But we wanted, again, to test the model, test the methodology. And we're also testing how to measure this besides the sort of typical workforce quant data, which is how many jobs are created and so forth and so on. But we also want to look at other things that could be measured as well, such as job satisfaction, you know, increased customer satisfaction, those kinds of things that are a little bit harder to measure. That's the methodology that we're working on.
Cool. I saw there were a few more policy suggestions, advocacy points in the chat. So I've added those to the photo here. On the right-hand side, we have contracts available to artists in doing community work, tax incentives for community businesses to have art installations in their facilities, college art credits, and I think include community garden projects as part of art installations and beautification projects. We are right at our time. We have about 1 minute left. So I want to thank everybody who participated today, Nelson Mullins, Jessica, Nadja, and we want to thank you for being here. I also want to mention that there is a session immediately following this one at 12:15 with YWCA of Greater Atlanta, who will be talking about policy from A to Z. How do you follow policy? How do you track policy? How do you work with legislators? So if you are interested in joining that, the link is in the welcome email that we sent out to everyone who registered. If you didn't register, you can follow us on Facebook. We are live streaming on both the event page and our Facebook C4 Atlanta page, so feel free to, you can join us that way. Or if you message me right now, I can probably still send you the link if you want to be in the Zoom room. So, but thank you so much for all of the suggestions and all of the interaction today. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you soon.
Great work.
Thank you, everyone.
Loved it, everybody. It was awesome.
Thank you.